Oh, welcome everyone to the 22nd virtual roundtable on measuring corruption. I am Joseph R. I'm very happy to be hosting today's meeting, and actually we have Issa and Jose for the second time in this series of roundtables. And today we're going to be hearing from them about the approach concerning network mapping and analysis that they have employed for their most recent paper. And I won't even attempt to summarize it because I know that I'm not going to be able to do a good job. So in a minute, I will invite them to introduce themselves, especially for those of you who weren't with us for their previous presentation. Before we do that, I just want to go through some of the basics about how the roundtable is going to be conducted. So the entire event is going to last 90 minutes. We don't really separate between the time of the presentation and the Q&A and open floor, which means that if you have any questions or comments at any point during that presentation, please raise your hand on the video or just click the little hand icon, and I will invite you to unmute yourself and ask the question. Otherwise, you can also ask your questions or make comments using the chat. Outside of that, I will ask you all to please keep your microphone muted, unless, again, I have asked Jose or Issa to make a pause so that we can have a little bit of a discussion. In my experience, it really opened the door to really interesting interactions and potentially branching out a little bit if necessary, but then we're going to try to bring it back to the presentation, of course. Other than that, as I mentioned already, this meeting is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the YouTube channel of the Japan Network of Anti-Corruption Researchers in about a month's time. And besides that, of course, a meeting report will be drafted by Ms. Bharat Resi, who is the research assistant joining us today. And it will be shared with you all in about a couple of weeks from now. Right. Other than that, yeah, I hope that you all enjoy today's presentation. And without further ado, Issa, Jose, the floor is yours. And please, if you can say something about yourself, and you can also start sharing your file whenever you are ready.
Well, thank you so much, Joseph, for this invitation. My name is Issa Luna Pla. I am a researcher at the Columbia University Inter-American Institute. And I'm also a researcher at UNAM, which is a university based in Mexico. And I have been conducting an observatory of anti-corruption and impunity for the past 8 years, researching these two phenomena from the complexity approach. And I'm very, very happy to see some of our colleagues and friends, Robert Bacon, Bonnie, and Irene Tello, of course, which from who we expect to hear very, very interesting questions and comments. Jose, would you like to introduce yourself before I put the presentation on?
Yes, thank you. Nice to meet you all. Good morning from Mexico. I'm Jose Roberto. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Physics of the National University of Mexico and co-leader of the Observatory of Corruption and Impunity with Issa Luna. So nice to meet you all.
Okay, so we're sharing this presentation, but the paper, as you've hopefully read it, is published in Trends in Organized Crime. It was published the 22nd of July this year, and we're very happy because this is this is a result of a hard discussion and debate with Jose and myself and other colleagues for many years in our quest to find a way to grasp the collective dynamics and organization of companies when they are misused in the public procurement market. So this is we're going to concentrate on public procurement, although we know that also in private procurement this phenomenon is happening. And the aim of the paper is to develop some of the tools that we can also share and apply to other type of procurement scenarios. As you all know, the motivation for this paper is a well studied phenomenon in crime, in economic crime by the OECD and the World Bank, that have identified the use of companies for criminal and illicit practices for many years as the phenomenon of money laundering and several corruption schemes as well. Procurement markets tend to create these environments that favor illicit activities. The literature in economics has long pointed this very important problem in many ways, and has presented several tools from the economics to identify incentives and the way this can be studied best. What we do in this paper is to take from understand how these other approaches have been understanding the procurement as a complex system, and add a layer of analysis as a contribution of our paper from this past literature that has been produced in the past few years. The first step was definitely to recognize that this is a complex system phenomenon, and it can be understood as an interconnected ecosystem. And here are some papers from Lira in 2022, but also Jose and myself have pointed this problem and this approach in 2021, and of course Cartes watches, and also, as we're going to see, Fasecas have also done so as well. So understanding this as a complex system, as an ecosystem, there's a few steps that have been taken from complexity sciences and data sciences to understand and grasp this phenomenon. First, as a buyer-supplier network, which is a bipartite representation of contracting data, and is like the basic structure that was modeled by Fasecas and Watches in 2020 in this paper, where they present this basic model of representation of the contracting market, where the squares represent buyers and the circles represent the suppliers, and these buyers and suppliers are connected by an edge if they have a contracting relationship. So the edges are represented in this very basic network from the contracting relationship, and then learning in a more intricate way. These the next paper in 2020 by Watches and other authors, also taking some data from the Hungarian procurement market. They plotted this large connected component of a network, and also included in this visualization the buyers and their suppliers connected by contracts. And they added the weight of the contracts in red in this network that is plotted here. So to this level, the studies about procurement, public procurement data have evolved in a way that in a bipartite representation of contracting data. Another work we took ideas from, and that we're trying to build upon this knowledge, is from Lira and others, where they introduced the Jacquard Similarity Index, which is the number of co-participations over the sum of total individual participations, which allows to group those networks into communities. But this time Lira goes into the firm-to-firm co-binding networks, where their interest is to understand internally these companies, how, or firms, how do they interact and they connect to each other. The goal of this paper was to detect economic cartels and their fraudulent activities in public tenders. And they were also able to group them for several markets as construction, food, services, and advertisement as well. So they published this paper in 2021, and then
Lisa,
Jose,
may I interrupt you for a moment?
Sure.
I have a question or a request for clarification, especially for those of us who are not very familiar with the procurement landscape, especially as addressed using a network analysis. Could you explain a little bit about what we should understand by co-bidding networks? And also you could say something to kind of like set the stage for the discussion of economic cartels, because I know that there's a lot of literature in terms of the composition of cartels and you know, that the issue of collusion and how that connects to the larger issue of corruption. But I was never completely clear about how cartels in the private sector would, or we could apply the label of corruption, for example, to collusion in the private sector as embodied in cartels. So you could say something a little bit about that. I think that would be great.
Yes, of course, in the procurement legislation, comparative legislation across administrations in various countries, there's two main processes for acquiring an award inside the government as a supplier, as a buyer. So the governments as buyers, they issue calls for suppliers, and there's two ways that this can be awarded. One of the ways, I mean, in general terms, one of the ways is a direct award, and the other way is a bidding award. And bidding award means that there's a competition that calls for several suppliers that are going to bid or compete for the same award, and that they have to present information and company financial statements and all the information that they are required to in order to get the best offer. So governments have standards and legislation to organize these processes, and in one of the the criminal literature is back from the 80s and even 60s have identified that it is possible that two companies that are integrated by the same members, stakeholders or administrations, can bid in a public procurement process, or hide or use other members of their family to hide their identity of the final ownership of these companies, and then and simulate that they have a different company. So this is very, very difficult to identify within the administrations and governments, as they only receive information and they have very limited resources to verify if the companies that are bidding or the firms that are bidding are integrated by different and real people, you know, that they have been constituted as a legal company. So basically, the criminal literature has identified that this has been a problem, and also the OECD and the World Bank have pointed that this can happen in economic crime. It is recognized when the governments have assigned those awards to companies, and those companies fail to comply with the terms of the conditions of the award. And also when they identify that there are that there's those companies are represented, or at the end are being owned by the same people, and that is what they identified as zero competition in the real market of those companies, and that is something that is very negative for the procurement and for the government expenditure rules and the compliance of those rules. So this has to do with due process rules in procurement that has been either in private or in public the world, very relevant for international standards and compliance standards.
So here, when you mention firm-firm co-bidding networks, does this mean companies that formally they look independent, but they participate in producing independent biddings for the same contract, like competing against each other for the same contract? Is that correct?
That's correct. I don't know, Jose, would you like to clarify more?
No, that's it. I mean, Joseph got it right. So companies or firms connect with among each other if they participate in the same tender, competing with different bids. So for one tender, you have a group of companies that connect with each other. So that's one event. So you add multiple events, and the companies that participate in different tenders start to connect different groups or different clusters, let's say, to form a big network. So that's what you are seeing here. And this is one of the best way to identify cartels by looking into the competition patterns. Yes.
So if I understand correctly, then, and I know that this is just the beginning of the presentation, and you're kind of still laying the ground before showing us your data. But I'm really interested in getting these aspects right, so then I can understand exactly what you did for the Mexican case. So when you say that this previous literature used these firm co-bidding networks to detect economic cartels, so I assume that if you find that kind of the same group of firms are normally submitting biddings to the same contracts over and over again, that you can estimate that there's a higher possibility or higher probability that they are coordinating their bids. Is that correct? Is that what you would call cartel, or are you thinking something differently?
That's just one part.
Okay.
Issa, could you go back look to the previous slide? Thank you. Yes, Joseph, that's one part of the issue. So, or the approach actually. So you need to compute these similarity patterns of competing, which is basically the Jacquard index or Jacquard similarity index. That's what it works for. So you need to compute the number of co-participations of two entities or two companies over the total sum of their participations over some period of time. So that Jacquard similarity tells you how many times or a proportion of times these companies have competed against each other in a tender. So the higher this Jacquard index is, the higher the probability that these companies might be in a position of cooperation or collusion. But that's the first part of the problem. The second part comes to using the network representation of these competing networks to computer to calculate something that is called modular or community structure. So this is here we are getting into network theory areas or topics. So, but the main idea is that when you have a huge network like the one you are seeing in the visualization, there are ways to identify groups in these networks. So these groups, according to this paper, have the potential or indicate a high probability that these are conforming, or these groups or communities are characterized by different cartels or just one cartel. So yes, in this visualization, for example, we have in color 8 communities, 8 groups in the network. Each of these groups have the potential to have embedded one or more cartels. So and these cartels distributes in different regions of in this case, this is a state in Brazil, if I'm not wrong. And there are different areas in which these companies compete, which is construction, services, advertising, food, etc. So that's the main idea. That's the main idea of this approach.
Yeah, and just let me add that cartels is a word that it has been adapted to these patterns that Jose explained, because as criminalists or criminologists say, cartels basically are, like groups of traffickers, or they are attributed basically to, those kind of crimes, not really in procurement, not traditionally in procurement, as you could understand, from Gambetta or these classics that talking about organized crime. But the use of economic cartels is in some of the literature just to represent this idea that there's these groups coming back again in a pattern over the time, and that those are it's a phenomenon that cannot be detected as if it is observed by an individual behavior of those firms, but as a collective behavior of the firms. And that is why the network analysis seems to be the best tool to identify this kind of group activity or dynamics.
Thank you. That helps a lot in clarifying this going in. Just very quickly before I give the floor back to you so that you can proceed. We have a couple of comments. So Claudia mentioned that indeed in Uganda she has observed the same, as companies coordinate their bids to ensure a winner, and then they take turns, right? So I think that would fit very well your description of cartels in procurement here. And Robert is also mentioning how that concept of cartel is very useful from the intelligence and judicial investigation point of view when targeting corrupt networks. And indeed, I 100% agree with him, which is I'm very excited about this approach that you guys are working with. Okay, sorry, I leave it back to you.
So we also take we also published this paper in 2021 where we try to approximate, as we were saying, with more indexes, as we created this conspiracy indicator that is helping us also to understand those connected components and how they behave over the time. And in this paper, we are trying to present this index as a conspiracy idea of how feasible is for these cartels to become clusters and perpetuate that. So basically, and I'm going to go real fast because I really want to jump into Jose's nitty-gritty presentation of the data, but this is basically what we're doing, just an analytical method to analyze fraud and corruption that is considered the 3 layers of the procurement ecosystem: the public, which is government companies, and the personal inside those firms or companies, right? We are interested about shareholders, administrators, legal representatives, commissionaries, all the people that we can have access to information to understand who is inside those firms. And the interest is to quantify the economic impact of single versus connected behavior. we have been oriented our research to also understand the behavior of companies that are already considered shell companies, which are qualified as that by the Mexican government when they fail to comply with the tax obligations, and Mexican government also includes these companies in these blacklists when they have no address that is verifiable, or where these companies are issuing bills that are fake, or that they have not been authorized by the government authority in a proper way. So those companies, a company can be considered as a shell or included in this blacklist of shell companies approximately a year or 2 years after it has been founded or created. So those companies have at least 1 year or 2 years to bid with governments or to make alliances with other companies, and then get some of the awards. Usually, and this is what our data is going to be representing, these companies have also in common that they all have were also included and investigated by the government for activities of money laundering and tax evasion. So the companies and the sample that is in our data sets from 2 localities or states in the Mexican country that are called Puebla and Guanajuato, those companies have were included in these blacklists, and they were working with state and municipal government institutions and were awarded those contracts for these at least these general categories or sectors of the market of procurement, which are government or administrative services, education, social services for government, health services, and security services. And as we can see, there's common patterns between the type of spending and the number of buyers that appear in both of the data sets, which are basically concentrated in the government and education sector, which means, and this is something that has been found by other sources also in Mexico, those are the 2 sectors where more corruption is and diversion of public funds is been happening. What we find here also in our paper is that the date of the creation, which are the tables that you can see in this slide, the date of the creation of these companies that later will become catalogized as shell companies by the government and included in this blacklist, they match. The similarity is that in 2015 there's an increased number of these companies that were awarded contracts, and as we understand from our basic research, I mean, this is not the goal of our paper, but we do understand that this is also the year of election, of general elections in Mexico, and there's other literature that also links the creation of companies to bid award and to get awards from government, and then non-compliance with the terms of those awards, and then they become part of these blacklists, and then they disappear and they declare bankruptcy without returning the money to the government or the services that they were awarded for. So this is basically the cycle of the fraud or the scheme that the companies that are included in our data sets are perpetuating. And
could I ask you something about that previous slide? Could you elaborate a little bit about the type of industries or type of contracts that would fall within the category of government?
Yes, I think Jose has the best answer there also.
Yes, yes. So, Joseph, for your question, I know that you were not a reviewer of this article, because that was one of the observations that one of the reviewers made to us. He was intrigued that the classification that we made for the buyers, for the government institutions, depended on the type of institution that buyer belonged to, and not the content of the contract. So yes, this classification is not based upon the nature of the contract or the contents of the contract, but on the nature of the buyer or the buyer institution. So we have to decide. We have the three branches of the government here: executive, legislative, and judicial. We have autonomous organisms, and we had to decide to propose a simple classification for those entities. And these five labels are provide a good summary of what type of institutions were let's say, involved in these scandals. So,
so for those of us who are not completely familiar with the structure of the Mexican Federation, so you're saying that at the state level, the education ministry or the secretariat is separate from social, health, security, and government also have their own institutions or structures that are separate from those other four sectors. Is that correct?
Yes, different institutions. Yes.
I see. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Although Issa could provide a better answer for that. Back to you.
I mean, I think your approach makes a lot of sense, but I also get why the reviewer would also think about classifying it by the nature of the contract, but I myself have encountered that question, and I don't think that there's a single answer to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot to say, it all comes down to the data. So the data here comes from different sources, and the data is very noisy. There is missing information, incomplete information, or wrong information. So we had to verify a lot of data. Yes, the public data are insufficient. That's it. Yes.
Yeah.
And we have to come up with a solution for that. So we didn't have enough or complete and homogeneous information for all the contracts, but we did have information for the buyers, the government institutions. So that's why we decided to do it based upon the buyers type.
And I also had a question, and this one is very quickly. It's about when Issa, you were describing the nature of the data, and I found really interesting. I mean, nowadays a lot more countries are implementing this level of transparency, in which indeed blacklisted companies that are reported through the transparency platforms and whatnot. So if I understood correctly, all the data that have been used here is in relation to the contracts awarded to the companies that were later blacklisted, correct?
Yes, correct.
Do we have a number of how many companies we're talking about here?
Oh yes, here the number of so the contracting period is from two. In the case of Puebla is 2015 to 2018, and then 2014 to 2019 in the case of Guanajuato. And also we have in the I don't do we have it, Jose, like the specific number? I think that was a slide in my head only.
Yes, there is a specific number later on.
Yeah, we're gonna as with when we describe the networks, we're gonna mention exactly the number of the companies and the buyers too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so we just didn't got there. So just one quick point about the data. There's in Mexico, there's few official government platforms that provide procurement data that is as good as it is, reliable, with several problems as well. So one of the data is from the Transparency Authority, that provides all the contracts have to be public by obligation, established by law, and all those contracts can be retrieved from a platform called Plataforma Nacional. And this platform is publicly available, and the contracts are publicly available, and they are obviously on PDFs, and the information to get information from those are really a very hard work to get. So the data that we have in our cases is also tailored with the collaboration of groups of journalists that provide their work with access to information requests to governments, and also downloading all that information that is available, and then helping to verify that information with other public resources to corroborate this. As we said, like, government data is very imperfect in this field, and there's many others. There's many steps to verify that the information is there, particularly when it comes to the personnel of the companies or firms. As we said, the data about the ownership and management of the companies contains information about the shareholders, the administrators, legal representatives, and commissioners. That is the basic structure of a company according to the Mexican legislations, and this is information that is included in those contracts as well, that are publicly available. And for privacy protection, we have anonymized all the information regarding the identification of these government agencies and the private companies and individuals in it. Although those companies, that information is already publicly available, and it can be tracked in all those platforms. Okay, Jose, I'm going to stop there.
Yeah. So thank you, Issa. You should continue. You can do it. Joseph, I think this is gonna be the part of the presentation that you might be interested in from your questions, that you found the technical aspects a little bit I don't know how to call it, hard to grasp. But I'm gonna try to provide some sort of tutorial, not very rigorous on the mathematical part, but I'm gonna try to present the methods that we employed with the results that we found. So it comes hand by hand, and maybe it would be a little bit easier than from the paper. So
thank you, much appreciated.
My pleasure. So we employed 3 methods in our paper. So this is the first one. So as Issa was explaining, the procurement ecosystems could be described in terms of 3 layers of information. One layer relates to public information of the government institutions. The second layer corresponds to the information about the companies, the suppliers, and the third layer corresponds to the people behind those companies, which is ownership and management. So here in our approach, we use two very popular and very used data sets, which is contracting data and ownership data. Actually, it's ownership and management. We're talking here about ownership, administration, legal representatives, something called commissary. I don't know if that is a figure in international law. So that's another one. And what we wanted to do is to combine these two sources of data into one framework of analysis that includes or that considers the network's approach. So contracting data allows to create bipartite contracting networks, which is the first approach that Facekas and Johannes Bash and other authors have employed to analyze risk of fraud and corruption in procurement. This is a direct representation of the contract. You have the buyer, you have the supplier, and that is the visualization. Yes, I apply the Levine algorithm, Monteverde. But not here. I'm going to explain later on where did I apply it. Yes, we have the bipartite contracting networks, buyer supplier, a bipartite representation of the contracts, and this is for case one. For case one, we have 53 buyers, government institutions, and 90 shell companies. All of these are shell companies, right? So, and on the second visualization, we have ownership networks, which are representations of companies connected to the people behind those companies, or the owners on the company's charts, which probably and most certainly are not the real owners of the company, right? So Monteverde was asking this question. Monteverde has made a lot of questions and comments. How to identify the real owners of companies and their relationships? Yes, here we have information about those people that are in the charts of the companies. So people listed as shareholders or administrators. But when it comes to shell companies, those people are not there's a very high probability, and we could almost be certain that those people are not the real owners of the company. So there are more powerful people behind those. And okay, so this is the third approach that Issa presented, which is the one that we have been developing in our work. But we want to integrate.
Jose, before you move on, could I ask a question concerning the previous slide? If you could go back to the previous slide. Yes, that one. So I just want to make sure that I'm reading this graph correctly, because I think if I'm reading correctly, it looks very interesting. So this graph of ownership networks, right? So because your data only concerns companies that have been blacklisted. So this pretty much means that in some cases, a number of cases, there are individuals who are connected to more than one company that has been blacklisted. Is that correct? I'm looking specifically at the upper part of this ownership network graph.
At the upper part, yes, of the ownership. Well, again, these all are blacklisted companies. These are all shell companies. So yes, thank you for that observation, Joseph. Yes, when we put the data of ownership into the network representation, you find different connected components or clusters. That is, companies that connect among each other because they share an individual, which are here the square symbols. And yes, they form clusters of different sizes according to the number of people behind those companies and the number of people they share among each other. So that's a good question. But all here are shell companies.
And just so that we're also familiar a little bit with the way that Mexican law works, when a company is blacklisted, that I guess that doesn't mean that the owners are also blacklisted from participating in public procurement. Or is it only the company that is blacklisted, or the owners of the company also get blacklisted?
No, it is only the company.
Okay.
As far as I know, Issa might have another.
No, yeah, and that's quite the problem. As we're going to say in the final insights of this paper, the legislation only sanctions the companies and forbids them to compete or to bid again. But unfortunately, the administrative legislation it doesn't cover the full complexity of this phenomenon, and that is why it is so important to portray it. As we're going to see, there's no specific sanctions to individuals.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Issa, could you? Yes, thank you. So that's the method one. It's very simple. Is to create buyer-supplier networks and to create supplier individual networks or supplier people networks. And the result of doing that, which is very simple, is the creation of these representations of data. So when it comes to where here in the visualization, you have the two cases, case one in the upper row, case two in the bottom row. And when it comes to the buyer-supplier networks, we found that they tend to form one big connected component, which is typical of high concentrated markets, reported in this article by Bash in 2020. So this is very interesting because we are looking here at not a complete procurement ecosystems, which consists of government institutions, shell companies, and not shell companies. So here are just shell companies, and these shell companies are connecting are getting contracted by all of these government institutions in these cases. That is, the buyer-supplier network is very different from the structure of the ownership network, for example. So this means that these shell companies are very active from an active or passive way, being contracted in these examples or in these cases. And on the other hand, when it comes to ownership networks, we found that networks are sparse. So you have many connected components or many clusters of different sizes because they share individuals, or they share few individuals, indicating low conspiracy, as we propose in our paper from 2021. So it's very interesting that buyer-supplier networks share similarities between the two cases, even though these are different states. And also when it comes to ownership, the structure of the ownership networks is very similar, even though these are two different cases. So this is the first result from the first method, right? Okay, people are having fun in the chat. Great. All right, so method
very much so.
yeah. So method number two, and method number two consists in finding these connected components of shell company networks, that is, we want to could you go back, please, Issa, to the previous slide? Thank you. So, not so back. Yes, that's it. So you have this, you have the data, you have the network representation of the data. And as you can see, there's a certain level of complexity to it. Many actors connected in many ways. If you try to analyze these networks by hand, of course, it's a bit of a headache. So there are numerical methods to analyze these networks, as it has been proposed in different papers. What we are proposing is to provide a new representation of these networks and combine them into one, which at the same time reduces complexity and allows probably better analysis of risk. So yes, Issa. So please, the next slide. So what we are gonna do first is to obtain connected components of shell company networks. What is that about? We want to reduce the complexity of the ownership data by changing the bipartite ownership network representation to a one-mode shell company network representation. There is, well, we're gonna incorporate information about individuals into a new representation in which the edges contains the information of those individuals. And we are gonna look at something called connected components. These connected components are obtained by projecting. It's a fancy word, by projecting the ownership by PyTorch network onto the set of supplier nodes. This sounds very convoluted, but it's very easy to understand. The intuition is that you connect suppliers or share companies among each other if they share at least one individual in a role of ownership or management. It's very simple. So I think that this sketch illustrates the idea of what we want to try to accomplish. Companies that share at least one individual get directly connected between each other or among each other. Those companies that do not share an individual with others remain isolated.
Yeah, Jose, sorry. As you probably can tell, I'm trying to follow as close as possible to make sure that I'm not missing anything or misunderstanding anything. So in the right side, right on the right side of the arrow, if I understand correctly, the nodes are still the companies, but then the vector now is ownership of those companies, correct?
Yes, it's a shared ownership or management.
Right. So
Yes.
in this case, the fact that those two nodes, those two companies are connected by the vector, that means that they share ownership. So they have the same, at least one individual. Or so it's, for example, because a company can be owned by a number of individuals, right? In this case, does it mean that at least one individual is common to both companies, or do they need to share the entire ownership structure?
At least one. In any role which are in your right side, the types of relations in the private sector.
As earlier you were talking about management, does that include also legal representatives and commissioners?
Yes, legal representatives and commissioners, yes.
Okay, so any individual that is common to both companies then would connect the two companies. Okay.
Yes.
Got it.
Yes. This is just to simplify the approach or the method we are proposing. You can make it more. You can come up with a more sophisticated model that includes more variables, more parameters. But this is the simplest one. This is the simplest one, just to illustrate what we are trying to propose. But yes, that's the main idea.
Thank you.
So, for example, just some, let's say, convention here. These two companies that got connected because they share at least one person on ownership or management is a connected component of size 2, denoted by Q2, right? And this one that got isolated is a connected component of size 1, Q1. It sounds weird because, I mean, when you talk about connected components, you might think that they need to be connected to something else. But this is convention, and this is from the rigorous definition of a connected component, which involves other ideas from network science. But this is the intuition. This is just to get a grasp of the idea. Sorry. Yes, so this is method number 2. We are going to extract connected components. Issa, please. The next slide. Yes, and these are the results. So you had the two ownership networks in the bipartite representation. You project via ownership, and you get what is illustrated in figure A, supplier networks or shell company networks. right? In which companies connect among each other if they share at least one individual. So here are some statistics about what we found. I mean, most of the companies are of size 1. You have Q1s here. Most of them are Q1s. I didn't illustrate those in the visualizations because these are trivial. So I just included in the visualizations those that are of size greater than 1. So you have connected components of size 2, 3, and so on. And the size of the biggest connected components reaches almost 10 companies. So in case 1 is size 8, in case 2 is of size 8, 9. So you have different sizes for these connected components. And those are the statistics in B, the frequency or the number of components by their size. And in C, we created this visualization to observe when these connected components were created. Why this is important? Because what we are trying to observe here is, or to consider, is that when companies are connected among each other, it is because the same people are behind them. So in some way, that points towards different schemes of operation. So maybe those companies that are isolated, working and were created in a different way from those companies that are connected among each other. So what are the results that we found here? We found that most shell companies, more than 50%, were created prior the contracted periods of each case, which are indicated in figure C by the vertical black line. Also, the shell companies were operating before the contracting period of analysis, and that the real economic impact should be even higher than what was reported in the investigations. So this is very interesting. So because there are some isolated companies or connected components or Q1s that were created even in the 90s, but that were awarded contracts a few years ago. So the way these companies or these clusters of companies are created is very interesting.
We have a question in the chat. Yes. I don't know, Jose, if you're going through it. We have
Which
a couple of questions
first?
from Justin, but potentially that may be closer towards the end of the presentation as they relate potentially to your results. But we have one that I think connects specifically to these graphs. This question by Carlota. I don't know if you already read it. The graph, she says, this graph shows suppliers that are connected to each other only, or is it suppliers co-bidding and that are also connected to each other? So basically, it's about if this graph already also represents the phenomenon of co-bidding.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Carlota. And no, I mean, we are not dealing with co-bidding networks here. We are just using contracting and ownership information, or contracting networks and ownership networks. And we are trying to combine those. The networks here, the visualizations here, are from companies that connect among each other because they share at least one individual in their ownership or management. Yes. So okay, so this is the second part of the results, and that was part A. This is part B. So the first part is very easy. You just applying the definition of connected components and see what we find. But when you have those, when you have that representation of connected components, you can apply some metrics which reveal some more interesting things. Here we apply two indicators or two indexes of diversity and favoritism. So don't fret. I mean, these are very interpretation of these indexes or indicators is very simple. Diversity tells you, or simply tells you, in which the amount to which one connected component has diversified operations among the different sectors in the government. So when this diversity indicator goes to 1 or gets closer to 1, is because the connected component obtain contracts in mostly all the government sectors, right? When the diversity indicator goes to 0, is because that connected component only participated in one sector. So that's the visualization in D. So we have these with matrices of groups of connected components versus the sector of the government in which they obtain contracts. And what we are plotting here is the spending, the percentage of money that each group of connected components obtain when they in the water contracts. So here, what you see is that Q1s again are the ones with the higher diversity. They spread among the different sectors of the government, and the sectors of the government with most impact are education and government, right? And on the right side, we try to observe, or we try to find a correlation between this diversity index and the spending or the amount of money extracted. For that, we use this indicator of, for that we use the indicator of diversity, and we plotted the amount of the diversity for each group of connected components, the diversity versus the spending, and try to see if there was some correlation. The correlation here is not strong. There is no strong evidence that diversity correlates with the amount of money extracted. Then, for a second indicator, there is the favoritism indicator, which basically is a weighted indicator that takes into account the amount of contracts, the P's of I or PI here, and the amount of, or the fraction of the amount of money awarded in those contracts or involved in those contracts. So this is a weighted indicator, and we wanted to observe again if there was a correlation between this favoritism indicator and the spending. So favoritism goes to 1 if a connected component obtain all the contracts and all the money, and goes to 0 otherwise, right? So yes, Issa, I guess that the second slide, the next slide summarizes the findings. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Yes. So these are the main results. Q1s have the highest diversification and impact. Education, which include public universities and other higher education institutions, and government, which include government institutions and administrative institutions, including executive, legislative, judicial, and other agencies, are the two sectors which with most impact. 75% of the money and 95% for each case. And for the second part, we found no strong evidence of a positive correlation between the amount of diverted money and the company's diversity, but we did find a strong correlation with the company's favoritism, which is interesting. Of course, this is not a general result, but for the cases of a study, it works, right?
Jose, I was also wondering about the situation here with the Q1 components, connected components. So Q1 are the ones that basically is the node that is not connected to any other node, right? So
That's right.
companies that only have one ownership and they don't share ownership with other companies. And in
That's it.
both cases, they appear. So I understand that in terms of diversity, there's no strong correlation. It does have a strong correlation in terms of favoritism. But in both cases, they tend to receive the higher amount of the higher percentage of spending of government contracts, correct?
Yes.
So normally this would then, again, and this is very much from you know, not having thought about this as much in depth as you have, of course, but normally I would think that companies that don't share ownership structure with other companies, potentially, I mean, they are not cartels, I would assume, because it's just the even though it's a shell company standing alone compared to groups or cartels of shell companies connected by shared ownership. So does this mean that it could be worse, so meaning that it's not as bad as it could be? Or am I misreading this completely?
Well, what I can say as far as our approach is that our approach maybe not be complete, because in order to see if these Q1s or isolated companies are indeed or belong to a cartel, we would need to look into tender data, into the co-bidding network, right? Because in the co-bidding network is when we see independently of the ownership and management, if companies are cooperating or colluding for obtaining a contract. So from that side, our approach it is still lacking in that aspect. That it still needs to be complemented, right?
Then allow me to ask a follow-up question, or perhaps to rephrase it. Is there, so because I sense that there's a lot of information packed in being able to look at the different tiers or the different Q1 compared to Q3. So basically the amount of companies that are connected to each other and how that affects the quality or the integrity of the public procurement process. And so I'm trying to figure out if that is basically what the analysis in terms of diversity and favoritism also tells us about, or if it's something that is separate from this analysis. Basically, is there any other insight that we can obtain or extract from considering the complexity of a structure of ownership among groups of shell companies?
It is complementary. I mean, the hypothesis here was that if the greater the size of the connected component, the greater the amount of money that was extracted, right? But what we found it was that it is not true, at least for these cases, right? We found the opposite, actually, that isolated companies are the ones that extracted more money, or that were used to extract more money. So that was the purpose of using this approach of connected components. The greater the size of the connected component, the greater the amount of money. But we found that was not true, at least for these cases.
Okay, great. That really summarized what I wanted to really make sure that I was getting it correctly. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad.
Yes. And may I also add that some of the application of these two indexes is also for preventive and for sanctions. You know, if you use these indexes to understand the damage that the companies have been doing in the extracting money that they have been taking away, it is more, I mean, in an administrative forensic investigation, it would be more important to have this information and to see what kind of companies and which companies must be sanctioned for which kind of offenses.
If I may jump a little bit to potentially spoilers alert zone, because you mentioned that one of the conclusions that you wanted to arrive at was exactly potentially the need for legislation to be adopted to also be able to blacklist individuals or people that are associated either through ownership or legal representation to blacklisted companies, right? But so looking at these graphs, right? Because the companies that tend to receive the highest percentage of public contracts are companies that are not really. So basically, if the individual was blacklisted, because these individuals are only associated with one single company, potentially this would also kind of reduce the impact of such legislation. Is that so?
Well, I would think that the need for investigating all the people in those companies is insufficient at this level from the legislative perspective. So most of the people that have participated in these companies, in these shell companies, are individuals that now have other companies and that they have been keeping their job. They have been keeping their activities and they still out there. Let's say that they still out there, gaining awards. So so in terms of determining what kind of individuals deserve which kind of sanctions, and how can this information and insights can help us design those sanctions, I would say that the best approach has to be to understand the modus operandi inside each of the schemes. But basically, as we're going to say, and this is how this all research started from other authors, is to raise flags in terms of these kind of schemes that can be perpetrated, either if it's a sole company extracting a large amount of money or a group of companies, because in corruption, as we can see, is not an isolated phenomenon. So it happens simultaneously in various ways.
Jose, and I'm sorry that I don't let you guys move to the next slide. It's just that there's so much information, and as I did mention in my email, I have so many questions. I had so many questions when reading your paper, because it's so very interesting. So if we may look for a second to the left graphs, right? D, case 1, case 2, and in red you have those sectors that are, in this case, so the amount of spending for those sectors, that the only ones that go beyond even 10% are those associated with Q1, correct? On case 1, we can see that is 40.2% for government, and in case 2, education and government, each one of them has 44%. Are we talking about, so that is percentage, correct? If I'm reading this correctly, does that mean that Q1 components in case 2, they represent across sections over 80%, almost 90% of it? Well, over 90% of spending, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, wow, okay. Well, so there is a big difference then, at least in the way that they are distributed by sectors, right, between case 1 and case 2. Wow. Okay. No, because I asked this because for a moment I was thinking, what would have happened if instead of using of dividing components in an interval way, if you were just to use kind of like a more ordinal scale between Q1 and anything that is above Q1 or between Q2 and Q5. But I guess with these numbers, it wouldn't really make a difference, right? Because just Q1 represents such a large amount of public spending.
Yeah, and hopefully for the next part of the methods, yes, it will be clear why this approach might be useful. And I don't know, Joseph, if you could guide me through the questions, or if you have another comment.
No, that was my only question. So, I mean, we still have the two questions from Justin concerning
yeah, I was thinking.
Okay, sorry.
I was thinking that Justin and Irene Tello have very interesting questions that we can elaborate in the final insights, definitely.
Okay.
For more practical results.
Yes, Daniel. I did analyze in more detail the government category, but I didn't include that information explicitly in the paper, because you have all types, every institution in those branches involved in these scandals. So it is quite risky. It is quite risky to include explicitly that information into this kind of studies. I mean, there are other ways to put that information out, as the journalists, investigative journalists that did the research did with their reports. But yes. So yes, Irene, hopefully the next part will shed some light into why those flags or those indicators, if I am correct, are useful, the diversity and favoritism indicators. For the connected components part, just tells you that there is no correlation between diversity and favoritism with spending, except for favoritism. So method 3 and the last part comes to putting all together, right? So we go back to the buyer supplier network, which it is still in this complete or full representation with all the details of which entity contracted which company. And we are going to take the connected components, the shell network representation, and we're going to put them together. So we are going to group connected components by size, labeled as QN, for example. All those connected components in the dotted ellipse are Q2. So we replace those QNs in the buyer supplier network, right? So the buyers are still these circles, empty circles, and the groups of connected components are the dark circles, right? Here I have highlighted for a purpose the connections of Q1s with the buyers, just for purposes of the paper, just to illustrate the amount of buyers Q1s were connected with. Then we are going to project onto the buyers, similar to the process or the procedure that we did for obtaining the shell company networks, in order to obtain weighted buyers networks, where the weights, which means which is the number associated with the connection, is the number of shared neighbors, right? Then, when I have these weighted buyers networks, I'm going to apply, or I'm going to compute the Jacquard for each weight or for each connection in order to transform or to obtain the fraction of shared neighbors among buyers, and compute the modularity or obtain the community structure of this network by an algorithm, which is the Louvain, which Monteverde was commenting about. So this algorithm, the Louvain algorithm, identify groups in the network according to their connections. Simply put, I'm not going to get into more details about network theory here, but this is just a way to identify groups of buyers which are more connected among each other than with other groups of buyers. So in this way, you identify regions in your network. right? These regions or modules or communities are labeled M1, M2, and M3. And this allows us to reduce or to obtain the final representation, which is the module component network, in which modules, which are buyers, connect with groups of connected components, which are suppliers, groups of suppliers. And what we want to see now is if this new representation provides us with more information or insights about these cases, which is the next slide, please, Issa. So yes, we apply the transformation to obtain the module component network. And here I'm just using one visualizations just to make it easy. In the paper, you could see the version in which I compare the two cases, and I include other statistics. But for the purposes of this talk, this is enough. This is sufficient. So what we found? So we found that in both cases, the complexity of the market is reduced. So the group of supplier reduces to just 3 modules of buyers, 3 groups of buyers, right? M1, M2, and M3. These modules are constituted by buyers of different types, as we have seen. And in case 1, all modules have the same size and concentrate most of the spending in the education and government categories. So for the 3 modules, education and government are the ones that concentrate the most spending, right? Also, when it comes to diversity and size, well, modules exhibit similar diversity but are impacted differently in monetary terms. Actually, the modules with lower diversity have the most impact, which is expected from the previous heat map. And in this case, we remove the contribution of Q1s in order to see the impact of connected components of greater size. So, I mean, this simplifies a lot the analysis of a huge network into smaller groups. But further analysis is required. Further analysis is required to see how this approaches would still provide us with intelligence about risk of fraud, collusion, and corruption. Yes. So I'm going to move into the final part, Joseph. I don't know if you have or anyone have a comment. But
let me just take a quick look at the chat. Personally, I continue hoping that I was able to really get all of that last part. It was a little challenging, but it's certainly a lot clearer now. And I think that I can appreciate the capacity of these approaches to extract more information that we would normally think when just considering a traditional form of network mapping using the data that you had. Which I assume it was the point of the exercise, right? To see how much by using different approaches and combinations and construction of these vectors and nodes, you'll be able to gain insights into this phenomenon. So no, it looked really great.
Yes, Issa, please, could you go back to the previous slide just to make a final comment? Yes, Joseph. So yes, I mean, this method or this approach was applied to very specific cases in Mexico, right? Which only include shell companies. I mean, the results here are not cannot be generalized, right? To other contexts or to other countries, to other scenarios. But the main purpose of the paper was just to provide the idea, just an idea on how this network approaches could be applied to identify levels of risks. So, for example, here, module 1 is the one with the lowest diversity and the most spending extracted. So if you're analyzing, you're a researcher, you are trying to identify hotspots in these networks, you would move into that M1 module in order to see which government institutions are in this module 1. And this reduces and concentrates, or allows you to concentrate your capacities into very specific high-level priority region of risk, right? Because if your resources are limited in terms of time, money, and human resources, you want to be efficient in your investigations and your prosecution. So you want to identify those regions which are priority. And these approaches provide you with that. So instead of analyzing the whole procurement by identifying or ranking by amount of money, maybe this approach would provide you with additional intelligence.
Yeah. So as we said, data is insufficient. Of course, we would have, in going into the question of Justin Schneider, it is definitely necessary to go into the information about the members of the government involved in those contracts. We were not able to link them because the contracts only have information about who signs. And usually the person empowered to sign is not necessarily the government official who also has the self-dealing with the companies if there's any collusion involved. So in order to get that information, we would have to go into the government directories and see if in those years which people was involved in those areas of procurement, and if those people involved in those areas of procurement have any investigation or open cases for administrative responsibilities. So, and that is just an example of how broad the information can go and how broad the network can be built if we have more information insights. That is another concern of Monteverde here in the questions. So let's jump into conclusions because we are also jumping on time.
Yeah, so I mean, it is what it is, right? If you indulge me, the conclusions are basically what is written here. I mean, the high level of connectivity in both the buyer-supplier and the module component framework representations indicate that the contracting of shell companies was not an isolated phenomenon, right? Of just a few public institutions. And that's what we saw. I mean, with the contracting data, right? That all the buyers and suppliers were connected in one huge connected component, in one big network, right? Which was very different from the sparse network of the ownership, right? So this indicates that the contracting of shell companies was not an isolated phenomenon of just a few public institutions, but a generalized mechanism of extraction across the whole procurement ecosystems, across the whole government, regardless of the sector, right? So second, we found that single shell companies have the most impact overall. Many shell companies, many Q1s were created a few years prior to the contracting activity of the cases. And it is unclear that this specific scheme of isolated shell companies was used to maximize profits. And overall, our results not only signal potential fraudulent operations of economic cartels, in these cases that have operated for many years, but also a form of organized crime emerging from the group activities.
So basically, we and this is just a closing remarks. We think that these characterized networks that misuse company procurement, it's a method that is very powerful to understand how the economic frauds are being committed. Also illicit transactions from integral part of the business model and orchestrated to secure contracts and purchases from individual company owners, companies, and also from group or clusters, as we saw in our models here. This is very useful, as also Robert Bacon has also pointed in the chat. This is very useful for crime prevention as a quantitative means to examine the ramifications of isolated versus interconnected shell companies operations and other companies operations that are not included in or even included in lists. Carlo Morselli has also researched this in Canada and found similar results. Network analysis as a tool for red flags. Irene, as we mentioned, I do have to say that it looks to me as we are in a very, very early stage of building all those algorithms that can automatically, with AI, do this into the platforms, and then, taking into account that we're going to have those platforms with the information available and that it is valid and it is, accountable and updated. But if we do have that, this is the type of research that is going to take us a step further to build all those tools that a government could use or organizations fighting corruption. And basically, what we're trying to track is some of the basic ideas of corruption, that it is the gradually starting with instances of bribery, white-collar crime, eventually transforming into a fully operation of criminal enterprises. And that is what the legislation, as we were discussing before, has to build instruments to prevent from happening, and to try to persuade companies not to do this and not to pursue from this type of schemes. So we will leave it like that on there. Joseph, thank you for the invitation again and this thoughtful discussion.
Thank you, Issa. Thank you, Jose. Wonderful work that you have done here. When I first read your paper, I saw the significance in terms of being able to identify and describe suspicious schemes and networks, and of course the potential of expanding this method to larger data sets. But now, after hearing the presentation, I can also now, I'm very excited about the possibility of being able also to identify very clearly government risk areas, as shown in the third method in relation to models. So I think that this fits very, very well within the larger theme of measuring corruption. And even though it wasn't framed in that sense in the paper, I think that this approach to network analysis has a lot of potential to continue informing the way in which we can continue measuring different forms of corruption. Before I let you go, Bonnie, do you have a quick question or any comment that you would like to offer?
Well, first of all, I'm going to take advantage of having everybody here to announce that Joseph is going to be a keynote speaker at the Academia Against Corruption in the Americas conference in Mexico City next week. And Issa was a keynote speaker 2 years ago. So it's great to see both of you here together. I have actually 4 questions that I saved for the end. They're mostly small questions. So curiosity, will you connect companies that share at least one individual, but did you look at companies that share an address, even if there aren't any individuals in common? That's the first question. Second, when you looked at the year of creation of the companies, did you consider flagging companies that were created right around the time of the change in government, when the new governor came in, either right before or right after they took office? And then what about todólogos, the jack of all trades companies that are getting public procurement contracts in several sectors, many sectors, which seems improbable, but is quite common in Mexico? Are you flagging those in any way through the networks? And then sort of a little bit of a bigger question. When you have a lot of unconnected companies that are co-bidding, then how do you distinguish between collusion and competition? Like if you have a small city and there are, say, 5 construction companies that have the capability to build roads, then it makes sense that all 5 of them would be bidding for every contract. And how do you determine that ex ante that it's collusion, or do you wait to see when there's deviation? Thank you.
Before we move to the answers, and because I know that we're already abusing Issa and Jose in terms of time, what do you say we accumulate questions? We have still Irene and Robert that have raised their hands. Irene?
Thank you, Joseph. So great to see you again here. I have just a question about if you also consider, and I think it's very related to what Bonnie said, then maybe what you're actually also detected in the networks is like another organization that it's being paid for by the corruption scheme to make this shell companies, because we have seen in Mexico, we have all these notaries and lawyers that are involved to actually create this complex ownership structures to actually get away from the people who are actually benefiting from the corruption scandals. So if you can actually detect that, because yeah, when I was checking your paper, when I see that you're checking for ownership data, I feel kind of rare with that term for Mexico, because like Joseph was saying, it's not ownership data. It's just like the contracts and the information on the contracts. And I think the interesting thing is going to be when we can actually connect who are the beneficial owners of these companies and how they are connected with the buyers and the government people behind giving these contracts.
Robert?
I just wanted to say, from the point of view of a practitioner who worked for years with the Department of Justice and Defense in the United States against threat networks, this is a fantastic line of thought theory, science, that it can be taken to converted into a tool for detecting out of character behavior. Now, we must remember that illicit networks, corruption, whatever is done we have incomplete data obscured by the criminals and all of that. However, this kind of thought enables the detection of out of character relationships and associations that don't fit what's expected. So from a enforcement, judicial investigation, from the intelligence investigation, this is excellent to provide us guidance to what to look into. There might be false positives. There might be, but it's an excellent tool. As a practitioner, I said, this is exactly what we have to bring down and digest, like Jose was saying, where it can be used, and probably like people like myself, because this can change reality, can improve the community. I really am fascinated by this, because I'm a follower of network analysis. Issa, Jose, well, we've been talking, this is extraordinary. Now, people like me have to make it available to the investigators. And we're gonna keep on talking. And Joseph, thank you for the invitation. And this has been wonderful. I took lots of notes. Now I'm gonna take it into my line of work. That's all. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Issa, Jose.
Well, very, very quick. Of course, this can be, Bonnie, very, I mean, we can make so many analyses out of this. this is a data that we have been using for other papers too, and that is why, because we keep asking questions like you to the same data sets. So company sharing addresses, we didn't look for that. It was not part of our hypothesis, but the data is there, and we have and we could have built another category in the data set with the addresses. But yes, that would be one of another type of of data you can relate and see if that brings a network as well. Year of creation around changing government. Yes, we if we wanted to correlate these into understand the phenomenon of the government changing and also elections, we would definitely have to include also the information of procurement, also from the National Electoral Authority. So that would be a great idea if you want to pursue that question on changing government and elections, and see how those companies show up in other registers of procurement, or those people, or the name of those people are showing up in other registers of procurement. But that would be an idea. As far as we know, in all the papers that we have published, we have found that there's a pattern of the creation of those companies with the date of elections. So there's definitely something there to pursue. Also, yes, there's a problem in Mexico with companies that do everything, sell from a pencil to a highway to governments. This is something that it has to be taken by the advocates of legislation, and to see and to reform the commerce code to restrain this possibility. I would leave the question from collusion to competition to Jose, maybe, and the notaries as well, because we do have a lot of information from there. Thank you, Robert, for your comments. We definitely look forward to make this more applicable for as a tool for the people like you.
Yes. So very quickly, thank you, Robert. I'm glad that you are our friend. I mean, thank you for your kind words. Irene, quickly, the idea or the objective of using ownership in the word ownership or an ownership data into our paper was with the purpose of llamar la atención, calling the attention of the researchers involved in those kind of studies. But at the end of the day, the information about shareholders, legal representatives is a proxy, works as a proxy for the true owners, for the true owners of a company. So the method, the analytical method still applies. It is just a matter of precision on the data, right? But it still works. And yeah, that was the main idea why we use ownership in our paper. Bonnie, yes, about the competing and the identification of cartels, we will need to elaborate, or we will need to create another study that combines tender information or competing information with these ownership networks in order to see if we could detect if one isolated company could be involved in a greater cartel, economic cartel. Yes, that would be another study, and this that goes beyond the scope of this paper. And what was the second question, Issa? Could you please remember me?
Regarding the companies as a coalition scheme versus a competition when there's limited companies bidding in the market.
Yeah, that falls into the same thing. We would need to elaborate another study.
Yes, with specific sectors.
it's very exciting that that you guys continue using the data sets and extracting as much insight and lessons from it, because it really does say a lot about the potential to continue working on advancing the methodological horizon of this type of approach and see really how much you can learn from the same amount of data, because normally we think of a new project, a new opportunity to collect new data, right? But then what happened to that old data that potentially still have a lot of information within it that we just haven't explored because we don't have the right tools for it? So in that sense, again, there's so many different angles that are interesting and valuable in the work that you have produced here. And I allow myself to right now to speak on behalf of everyone else here to congratulate you for this great paper that you guys published. And thank you so much for taking the time. I mean, over 90 minutes with us, almost 2 hours. Thank you so much. It's a lot more clear for me, and I hope that it's also a lot more clear for the rest of people participating today with us. And hopefully for the people that will be watching this video later on our YouTube channel. So thank you again, Issa, Jose, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Please stay tuned for an update concerning November's roundtable that I think you will also be very excited about. I hope to see you all very soon. And until then, have a good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Joseph, before you go,